Hello class, and welcome to your next lecture in environmental biology. In this lecture, we're going to be learning about communities and how to study a population. If you remember in our previous lecture, we talked a little bit about ecosystems, and we mentioned that ecosystems include not only a group of organisms that are part of the same species, but it also includes organisms that are different species, and it included interactions between the abiotic and biotic factors in that environment. So we talked about living and non-living things interacting with one another. In this lecture, we're going to be going more in depth into how do populations change within a given ecosystem. So are there fluctuations? Does the number of rabbits increase in a particular ecosystem? Does the relationship between maybe foxes and rabbits affect their population growth? Are there changes in weather? Are there changes in climate? Are there changes in terms of the amount of competition they have up between each other to get food as a resource? How do all of those relationships change the population? Meaning, did one species die out? Did another species gain in population? So we're going to be looking in this chapter at a topic that we call demography. And you may have heard that word before, you may not have, but demography is studying populations to examine them and to determine if there are trends. Meaning, is the population increasing? Is the population decreasing? So hopefully you'll enjoy that as we go through it, because this is a really fascinating area when you look at an ecosystem and start to think about, why did a particular species die? What caused it to die? Was it because a new organism joined that ecosystem? Was it maybe because of a human impact, right? So we're going to think about how population dynamics change in various different ecosystems. So when we begin to look at population demography, one of the ways we can analyze different species is by looking at something called a species distribution pattern. And that's going to allow us to see how a particular species is distributed within a given ecosystem at a specific point in time. So it's sort of like looking at that ecosystem and seeing where the organisms are distributed. Are they in one particular area of the habitat? Are they evenly distributed? It gives us a visual glimpse of what the pattern looks like. So let's take a look at an example of how species are distributed differently. So for example, here on the left, you can see in this species distribution, we could say that there's a random species distribution. Maybe we were looking at a ladybug or a small insect, and we could say that they're all over this particular habitat. What about if we were looking at these elephants and how they are distributed in their habitat? We wouldn't say that they're all over the place. They're not up here in the mountains. So we would call this species distribution clumped because they're all clustered together. Penguins are a unique distribution because they tend to evenly distribute themselves. They leave a little space in between one another even when they're moving. So they are described as having a uniform species distribution. So when we think about a population, different organisms distribute themselves differently in a given habitat. Another way that we can look at a population and think about how is that population changing is by looking at something that's available in your textbook called a life table. And a life table basically shows you the history of an organism. So, for example, when do organisms of this particular type tend to die? When are they born, right? How many of them are there? So these life tables give you kind of a snapshot of important population data about a particular species. So let's look at one of those together. So here's one for a particular type of sheep called a Dall Mountain sheep. And it tells you here in the first column the age interval of the sheep, right? And so let's look here at sheep that are about 1 or 2 years old. it tells you that out of 1,000 of the sheep that are at 1 or 2 years old, about 12 of them die. It tells you that about 800 of them survive from the time they're 1 till the time they're 2 out of 1,000. So you can see that about 800 out of 1,000 survive. And then this number here, 15, tells you the mortality rate. That means out of 1,000, about 15 of those sheep die. And this last column over here tells us about their life expectancy. So you aren't expected to memorize every single number on this chart, right? I wouldn't ask you about specific numbers here. But what I would want you to know is that a life table can tell us a lot about an organism. Right? It can tell us a lot about the species so that we can get a good grasp for how many are living, how many are dying, right? When are they dying? How old are they when they're commonly dying? Right? So looking at those in your textbook is really a good way to get a feel for what a life table is. So when we look at populations, one of the things that we want to examine is how quickly they grow. So if you look at the graph on the left, on the y-axis right here, you'll see population size. On the x-axis right here, you'll see time. And so over time, what happened to the population? Did it get bigger? It did. So in an exponential growth graph, you will see that as time passes, it seems like the population just gets larger and larger. So it means that the population is reproducing and it's continually growing without ever slowing down. But on the right-hand side over here for logistic growth, we don't see that happen. We see that the population increases over time, but then eventually it starts to kind of slow down and taper off because we hit something called a carrying capacity. And we'll go over what a carrying capacity is. But when we compare logistic growth and exponential growth, you can see that some populations, like this one here on the left, the growth is just continuing really, really fast, right? What's an example of something that grows in an exponential fashion? Well, one example would be bacteria. Think of bacteria growing in your bathtub when you don't clean it. Over time, that bacteria can just grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. Nothing's going to stop it from growing. But when we look over here, on the right hand of this slide, when we look at this logistic growth graph, it's important to think about what caused this population to eventually taper off their growth. What stopped the growth, right? It's reaching something called the carrying capacity. And that carrying capacity is important because it's going to be something that limits the growth of that population. So we describe a carrying capacity as the maximum population size that can be sustained over time in a particular habitat. So what that means is if we were looking at a bird population and when do they hit their carrying capacity, well, maybe when they reproduce and there isn't any space left, right? There's no more trees, there's no more branches for them. Then they have hit their carrying capacity. They're not able to grow anymore because their growth is no longer sustainable, right? So a carrying capacity, you could think of it as like hitting a maximum. You could think of a carrying capacity for an elevator. It's when you can't fit any more people in that elevator, right? It's not really like a population size, but you could imagine it sort of like a maximum. You can't go past this amount. So when we look at different populations, we're going to group them into K-selected species and R-selected species. Now, what do those two terms mean? Well, they're describing different types of species. So some species spend a lot of time really nurturing and looking after their offspring, and they have very few. So if we looked at an elephant, we would say that the elephant, when it has offspring, meaning when the elephant reproduces, the baby elephants are looked after. They spend a lot of time together. They have to contribute a lot of resources to look after that baby elephant, right? They have very few offspring, meaning that a mother elephant wouldn't have 100 baby elephants, right? They have fewer large offspring. We would describe this type of growth in these species, K-selected species, as being really stable and predictable. It takes a long time, the gestation period is long, and so you produce a really stable growth pattern. With our selected species, we would notice that the growth is really unpredictable. You would never know how much that species would grow because it's so irregular and there can be large fluctuations in their growth patterns. And this is often because when they have babies or reproduce, they don't have to do much to look after them. So for example, if we compared a jellyfish parent to a jellyfish offspring, the offspring don't need much care, meaning when they're born in the water, they're relatively self-sufficient. They don't need a lot of care. So the parents could have many offspring, and the population could grow or decline really, really quickly, right? They're not organisms that need years and years and years of nurturing and care. So we contrast these two different types of populations. So think of K-selected species as being species where it's really slow and stable growth. Our selected species, it's very unstable and unpredictable, and you can't really know how many offspring to expect in the next years because it's so erratic in terms of how these species grow. And your textbook has more about the K and R related species and pictures of them as well. So we now want to take some time to look at human populations and to think about how do human populations grow and how do they change over time. Have we always had this many people on Earth? Do we have more now? Yes, we do. We have 8 billion people, roughly, on our planet, and we want to take some time to look at how has the human population grown? How has it changed over time? So you want to make sure you know that we have 8 billion people on Earth, and when we look back, let's say 1,000 years ago, we realize that our population was very, very different. So even if we look back at the 1600s or the 1700s, we weren't even at 1 billion people, right? So it took a long time to get to 1 billion. And then after that, you'll see that it almost starts to look like an exponential growth pattern. We have these huge increases in human population. From the 1800s to the 2000s, we went from 1 billion to over 7 billion people. And a lot of that has been due to changes in food production, right? Changes in reproductive rates, changes in development in different countries, right? Changes in access to healthcare. There have been a lot of different things that have allowed our global population to really explode. And now the question that people want to consider is, how much more can it grow? Have we reached a carrying capacity? Are we past it? Is there still a lot of space for more growth? And decisions and ideas on that really vary from person to person. So let's look a little bit closer at some of the data about the human population. So if you look at the 1800s here at the very top of this bar graph, you'll notice that at the 1800s, we were at about 1 billion people. So what could we say about this graph? We could say that from 1800 to 1930, 130 years had to pass before 1 billion people were added to our population. But in the late 80s and the late 90s, 1 billion people were added to the population sometimes in just about 12 or 13 years. So we see a huge change in how quickly the population started to grow compared to the 1700s and the 1600s. Recent population growth has been much faster. So while it took over 130 years for the population to increase by 100 in the 1800s, today we see that every 12 to 13 years or so, you could have 1 billion people more added to Earth's population. But we're noticing that when we look ahead into the future, ecologists are predicting that there will be decreases in that growth as people choose to have fewer children, as people specifically in Europe and the United States are having fewer and fewer children. We're noticing that in the future, the population growth will not be at the same rate that it was in the late 1900s. This next slide depicts something called an age structure diagram, and these are shown for you in your textbook as a way to predict future growth. So when you see a population where you have a lot of people under 15, so everything under this dotted line represents males and females in a given population that are below 15. When you see a lot of people below 15 and very few people over 65, then population ecologists can look at that population and say there's going to be rapid growth. But if you look at the population and you see a wide kind of triangular shape where the majority of the population is between 15 and 65, then they predict a really slow growth pattern. So you don't have to be able to draw one of these age structure diagrams on an exam. You're not expected to know how to calculate it, but if you're interested in learning more about the age structure diagrams, you could look at them in your textbook. But I would want you to know that they're a way to predict or to forecast future growth of populations. They're a way to look at a population and examine how might this population change in the years to come. So when we look at our human population, what we see is that the well-developed countries are not increasing their populations as fast as developing countries. So developing countries, for example, places like sub-Saharan Africa, large portions of Southeast Asia, this is where we see a lot more growth. Growth is at 2% or more. But if you look at places like the United States or, for example, Australia, you'll notice that the growth is right at 0%. What that means is we're just replacing the people that were already in the population. We're not actually growing. So globally, the trend is that in developed countries, highly developed countries, population growth is decreasing, but in less developed countries, population growth is increasing. So the idea is that our population globally is really going to shift where there are more people in less developed countries. Those less developed countries are going to be having a higher population density. The next portion of our chapter is looking at communities. And remember, when we think of a community, we're not just looking at one type of organism, we're looking at many different organisms and how they interact with one another in an ecosystem. And we can look at how different populations of different species interact with one another. So let's say we looked at a spider population and a snake population, or we looked at a grasshopper population and a hedgehog population, and we compared them. Did they have any interactions? Did they relate to one another at all? Right? How did those communities interact with one another? How did those populations connect? That's what we refer to as community ecology. So think of two different species in your head. You could think of any two animals you want to, maybe dogs and cats. That could be a really obvious one, but you could imagine two different species. And I want you to just take out a sheet of paper and just for a minute, jot down what are the ways they interact with one another. You could write down something as simple as dogs may bark at the cats and the cats may scratch the dog. I don't know. You're welcome to write anything you'd want. Take just a few seconds to think about how do different species interact with one another. Did you come up with anything interesting? Did you think about ways in which organisms eat one another? right? You may not have written down something that violent, like they consume this other organism, but you might have. When we think about how populations connect with one another, we often think of predator-prey relationships. One organism is the predator, trying to hunt their prey. And when the predator eats the prey, we describe that as being a predator-prey relationship. So we could describe a hawk swooping down and picking up a little bunny rabbit as a predator-prey relationship, right? How do they interact with one another? And then when they consume the prey, what effect does that have on the ecosystem? So let's take a look at a graph from your textbook of a hare and a lynx. Okay, in red, you're seeing the predator-prey dynamic from the hare. Okay, so let's take a look at some predator-prey interactions. So in this graph, we're looking at an organism that can be consumed by another organism. So in red, you're seeing a hare, which is like a type of a rabbit. In the pale blue color is a lynx, and that's a type of wildcat, and so they eat hares. And so let's look here at the beginning of the graph. You'll notice that there were 50,000 lynx, and then there were almost 100,000 hares, meaning almost 100,000 little rabbits. And what do you notice started to happen when the hare and the lynx interacted with one another? Do you see this big decline in the hare population? What you could assume is that these lynx ate them, right? They were the predators, and so they declined the hare population. But eventually, they could eat so many of the hares that there's so few of them left that now the lynx don't have enough prey to survive. Does that make sense? So they've eaten up their main food source, and so now they don't have a food source anymore. And so the few that are left can now start to reproduce exponentially and increase and increase and increase. And the nice thing is that'll help the lynx population increase because now they have food again. So what we see oftentimes in a predator-prey relationship is kind of this up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down pattern, because as they start to eat their prey, the prey decrease. Then the prey decrease so much that it actually affects the predator. Their population doesn't have enough food to eat anymore, so then they decrease a little bit. When the prey don't have any predators eating them, then the prey start to increase again, right? So it kind of follows these boom-bust cycles of population growth. What are some other things that can happen in a community? Well, we can have predators and prey interacting with one another. Another thing you might have written down is how organisms hide from one another. How do they avoid getting caught? How do they try to survive? So one of the methods in natural selection that allows predator and prey to evade predation is by actually using really impressive traits, things like camouflage and mimicry, and having really strong poisons that they can release on the predator so that they don't get eaten, right? Even something like a skunk releasing a smell is a way to not get eaten by a predator. So on this slide, we just have some pictures of camouflage. Right here, you can see a little squirrel that's camouflaged itself into the tree trunk. Here you can see an animal that you all will recognize that has camouflaged itself, right? And again, it's not a perfect way of avoiding getting eaten by a predator, but it's a helpful tactic that can increase an organism's chances of surviving through natural selection so that it doesn't become the prey of a predator. What are some other things that organisms can do? Even plants can have defense mechanisms against getting eaten, right? And so things like having spikes or thorns, having poisonous flowers. There are lots of different ways, chemical ways, mechanical ways, that organisms can fight predation, right? To make sure that they don't get eaten. Another mechanism that organisms can use to avoid predation is mimicry. So you'll see how the wasp on the left that is harmful, how close its appearance is to the hoverfly on the right, right? So this process of sort of mimicking another organism can confuse a predator and can also confuse the prey, right? So really mimicking or looking just like another organism is a way that different types of species have undergone natural selection to allow themselves to not be consumed by other predators. The next section in your chapter goes over the idea of competitive exclusion. And what that means is that each individual organism is able to compete in a way that allows it to fit in its ecological niche. That means that the resources that each species needs are different, and that allows them to compete differently in a given habitat. So think of how far that flamingo's neck reaches below the water to catch prey. Compare that to how far the oyster catcher can dig to catch prey, right? You'll notice a huge difference. So what would we say? We would say that the oyster catcher and the flamingo occupy different ecological niches, meaning that the resources that the flamingo needs, the interactions that the flamingo can have, the prey that the flamingo can catch are different than the oyster catcher, right? So each organism is able to compete to catch prey differently, and it's very unique. So we would say that every organism finds its own perfect niche. And sometimes they use this word niche even in careers. They would say that each one of you as students has your own unique set of skills, right? And how well you do in a particular career depends upon your skills and how far you're able to go or what your particular talents are. And so sometimes you'll hear that word. You have to find your niche. I mean, you have to find just the right spot that works for you with your skill set. So that can be really meaningful for a human when we find our niche where we really enjoy working in the habitat that works best for us. Same thing for an organism. When an organism is in its correct ecological niche, it's able to really survive well and reproduce and grow and prosper. So the competitive exclusion principle is basically saying that no two species can have the exact same niche, right? They're not made the same way. They don't interact with other organisms the same way. They don't even interact with the soil and the air and the water the same way. So they're showing you here in these three graphs how one organism can thrive and another organism can thrive, but when you throw both of them together, and these are two different strains of bacteria, but when you throw them together, one declines rapidly and another one increases. So they're explaining in this section of the book that competitive exclusion shows us that both species can't always occupy the exact same niche, right? One of them may suffer until it finds its own niche. And so when we think about how organisms relate to one another, sometimes they can help each other, sometimes they can hurt each other, sometimes they can work together. So we describe all of these interactions between different organisms that are in different species as symbiosis. So symbiosis is a word that refers to interactions that are really long term. So if you think of maybe someone that has had a job for a really, really long time, we wouldn't consider that to be a symbiotic relationship because it's not two different species, right? That person and their boss, they're both humans. But what about organisms that connect that are different species? That's symbiosis. And there's three different kinds. So it's important for you to know a little bit about all three types of symbiotic relationships. We're going to go over three of them together: commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism. Now, these are three different types of relationships that you see in many different ecosystems. Remember when I asked you to write down how do different organisms interact? Maybe you mentioned that these two organisms fight with one another. That's a type of interaction, a type of relationship. So let's go over all three: commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism. Let's go over mutualism first. In mutualism, we would say that both organisms benefit. So when we consider the interactions between a flower and a bee, they both benefit. The flower gets pollinated. The bee gets nutrition from the flower, right? The nectar is a source of sugar for the bee, and so they both are benefiting. What about commensalism? Commensalism is where one organism benefits and the other one, it doesn't really benefit and it doesn't really get hurt either. It's just kind of neutral. So an example of commensalism are barnacles. You may or may not have seen barnacles, but underneath the surface of a whale, these little spots that you sometimes see are actually barnacles living on the whale. And it doesn't hurt the whales. And it helps the barnacles. The barnacles are able to find food really easily, and they're able to get shelter and protection from the whale. And it doesn't hurt the whale, so the whale is kind of unaffected. So we would describe this as commensalism. Commensalism is where one organism benefits and the other one is largely unaffected. The third type of relationship that we want to look at is parasitism. And this is an example where one organism benefits and the other organism gets hurt. So think of a tick and a cat. A tick living on a cat hurts the cat, but the tick benefits because it gets the cat's blood. You could think of a tick living even on a human. It hurts the human and can cause infection in the human, but the tick benefits because the tick can drink the blood. And so symbiosis is an example where we're thinking about different ways in which organisms interact. So 3 examples of symbiosis are mutualism, where both benefit, commensalism, where one organism benefits, and parasitism, where one organism benefits and the other organism gets hurt. So as we go over different community interactions and different ways in which species connect to one another, we begin to characterize different characteristics of communities. And so some of them that are really important is to think about how many different kinds of species are in that community. How are they interacting with one another? Is there a lot of species richness? Is there a lot of diversity, like in the coral reef you see on this slide? You can imagine that there are lots of different species and there's a lot of diversity and abundance in that community. Here on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see a map where we're comparing North America to South America. When we compare the species diversity in South America to North America, what do we notice is the difference? South America looks a lot darker compared to North America. Darkness on this map represents higher numbers of mammal species per square mile or per square kilometer. So when we look at South America, we would imagine that the communities in South America, the ecosystems, have a higher degree of species richness and a higher amount of biodiversity compared to the United States or portions of North America, where we would see that the number of different types of mammal species found in those communities would be very few. Right? So when we think about a community, we can characterize it based on how many different types of species it has, how much species richness it contains. So we've gone over different types of interactions between species. Another thing we can look at is whether or not a species has invaded a particular community. Has it hurt the whole community? And so we describe these in ecology as being an invasive species. So an invasive species is usually something that's changed the whole community. An example of that are zebra mussels. Here's a picture of them, and they often negatively impact the ecosystems. They are filter feeders, and so they sometimes filter out the algae that's needed for food. And then oftentimes they hurt the native mussels that are in that particular community. And if you look here, you will see a clogged water intake that oftentimes power plants have to spend a lot of money removing all these zebra mussels that are attached to them. So we would describe these as invasive species because they affect the community in a negative way. So when we think about this lecture and what we've kind of gone over, we've thought a little bit about how species connect with one another, how they interact, how they have predator-prey relationships, how they have symbiotic relationships. And so when we consider studying how a community changes over time, that's what we refer to as community dynamics. So the dynamics describe the changes that happen over time in a given community. So when we consider how communities change over time, we also want to look at how they change after a disaster or after a disturbance, like maybe a fire. After a fire has happened in a forest, what happens? Over time, slowly species will start to appear in that forest to repopulate that area. So here, after a forest fire, we can see initially there's a little bit of plants starting to grow, then later some shrubs and some pines, and then eventually we would see much more mature trees that have grown. And so this kind of sequential appearance that over time, after a disturbance happens, the organisms continue to grow and develop. We describe this phenomenon as succession. Succession describes how over time a community can change after there is a disturbance. How over time, one after another in a sequence, the new organisms will start to grow. Right? Over time, the trees got taller, and this is described as succession. So that brings us to the end of Chapter 4. As you go through the Chapter 4 material in your textbook, if you come across any questions or you don't understand maybe something in the chapter, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to go over something with you and maybe go through the material again in the lecture to help you understand any of it a bit more easily. Okay, so good luck as you go through this Chapter 4 material, and I look forward to hearing from you.